At the Beef Feedlot Roundtable earlier this week in West Point, we talked with UNL Extension beef specialist Galen Erickson about his latest research, including transitioning cattle moving into feedlots from forage-based to grain diets.
Yeah, it's common for feedlots when cattle first come into the feedlot to transition them off of forage-based diets to grain. And most people think there's only one way to do that. And over the last few years, we've actually determined that there's a dozen ways to do that. And interestingly, they all work pretty well. So we've been looking at using byproducts and different types of byproducts instead of forage. And the cattle adapt well.
So give me an example of that. I mean, and first off, I guess we should say, why did you start looking into this, or what made you think you could?
Well, as everyone's well aware, the byproduct supply is dramatically greater, which usually means that prices are very competitive. And forage supply is not, it's variable from year to year, and prices are variable from year to year. And most importantly, feedlots really do not want to handle forages or roughages because they're so bulky and relative to their nutrient content so expensive. So all feedlots would like to have alternatives to forage, so it was a logical fit to be evaluating it.
Give me an example of something that works and you think is beneficial for a producer.
Well, the Sweet bran, which is the Cargill's gluten feed, and gluten feed work really well. In fact, it improves performance over just using forage to step cattle up. But distillers grains don't work quite as well, and actually combinations then of gluten feed and distillers work well. And then there's a couple other new commercial byproduct products that are available that work well.
Is there another step in this research?
Well, most of it's, I would say, completed. We're debating on where to go next. For instance, my colleagues at Scotts Bluff at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center have been looking at beet pulp, because that's a common byproduct of that area. So yes, I think that it opens the doors that anything that's not grain may work to adapt cattle, but I don't know which direction we'll go because we've evaluated most of the byproducts we have here in central East Nebraska.
You'll also be talking today about updates on other UNL research, and something we've talked about on this show is ethanol production. And while it may be scaling back, one of the things you're looking at is using corn syrup from ethanol plants to feed to cattle. Talk a little bit about that research.
Yeah, this is a liquid supplement that comes out of the plants. It handles like a liquid, and I would say the value's been less known in the past, and so most of the previous work done back in the 90s was feeding it up to 10 or 12% of the diet. And we've been looking at feeding it at 20, 30 or more % of the diet, which most people think was a little bit of a wild idea. And ironically, it worked well, up to 27%. But that was with just corn in the diet and replacing just corn. So now we've done 3 other experiments looking at what happens when you have other ingredients in the diet, like if you're already feeding distillers grains, how much more on top of that can you add the syrup? And it's been quite interesting. The diets don't look good. If feedlots would have driven by our studies, they would have said, well, those diets won't work. But the cattle seem to do okay on them.
And finally, wet distiller, something that was a little surprising to me, and maybe you as well. You're trying to feed, or you're experimenting on feeding spoiled wet distillers grains. Why did you think of doing that?
Yeah, it seems a little funny that we would actually test the impact of feeding spoiled distillers grains, but if you're a smaller operation and you purchase wet distillers grains, which is very competitive, but you need to buy a semi-load quantity and it takes you months or so to feed up, it's very difficult to not have some of it spoil. And so we want to know what's the impact. And what happens is while that's sitting there spoiling, you lose 5 to 12% of the product. But ironically, the cattle don't seem to mind whether it was spoiled or not. We had some non-spoiled compared to spoiled, and cattle did the same, and we did it twice just to look at it.
Erickson says of the 2 spoil tests, one was in the summer and the other in winter, and the tests were done to growing cattle in one test and finishing in the other.